At 4:45 on the morning of the 1st of September 1939, without formally declaring war, aircraft of the Luftwaffe, Germany's Air Force, crossed the Polish frontier. The mission of almost 1,400 fighters, bombers and dive bombers. The systematic destruction of Poland. German Messerschmitts rapidly established air superiority, ruthlessly knocking Polish fighters from the skies, while German bombers pounded Polish military and civil targets. Working under the protective fighter cover, German forces were unleashed against the Polish army. The outcome was never in doubt from the start. In little more than a month, all resistance had been crushed and the Polish state ceased to exist. Poland had succumbed to a new form of warfare, which would conquer most of Western Europe in the next 8 months. The Nazis called it Blitzkrieg, or lightning. The attack on Poland was a natural development of Hitler's hunger for conquest. He had already absorbed Austria and Czechoslovakia. Poland was his next target. Rivalry between the two countries had already soured relations, and armies on both sides of the German-Polish border were preparing for war. Planning for the invasion of Poland had begun in April 1939, when Hitler ordered the German General Staff to launch the operation known as Fallweiss, Case White, 5 months later. In many ways, Poland was an ideal theater for the new kind of combined arms operations being developed by the Wehrmacht. It was fairly flat, and therefore suitable for mechanized operations, while its long borders meant that the Polish army was overstretched. 1 hour after the initial Luftwaffe strikes, it was the turn of German ground forces to swing into action. Over 40 German combat divisions were committed to the Polish campaign. Providing the spearhead of the German invasion force was 6 panzer divisions and 8 motorized infantry divisions. These were supported by 27-foot slogging infantry divisions. The main role of the infantry was to engage the bulk of the Polish army, while the German mobile forces raced round the flanks, cutting through supply lines and striking at command and control centers to the rear. The role of the Luftwaffe was to provide close air support for the German ground forces. However, German aircraft also played a more strategic role, striking at Polish airfields and aircraft, road and rail centers, concentrations of troop reserves and military headquarters. A number of Polish aircraft survived the initial attacks and put up stiff, if limited, resistance over the following week. But it was too little, too late. Von Rundstedt's Army Group South comprised 3 armies. 8th Army on the left drove for Lodz, while 14th Army on the right aimed for Krakow. In the center, von Reichenau's 10th Army had the bulk of the group's armor. Its mission, to pierce the gap between the Polish Lodz and Krakow armies, link with 8th Army mobile units, and push on to Warsaw. Attacking simultaneously was von Bock's Army Group North. Küchler's 3rd Army drove south from East Prussia, while von Kluge's 4th Army struck from the west across the Polish corridor. The attack was spearheaded by the panzers of Guderian's 19th Corps. The world was stunned by the pace of the attack. while German panzers crossed the river Wartha, Britain and France demanded the instant withdrawal of all German forces. In the face of the contemptuous silence with which this was greeted in Berlin, the Allies consulted on how best to implement their promises to Poland. A final ultimatum was sent to Berlin and ignored. At 11 a.m. on Sunday, the 3rd of September, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain broadcast the news that Britain was now at war with Germany. The world would realize, he felt sure, what a bitter personal disappointment this was. After all, Hitler had given his word not to attack. The campaign was planned as a massive double pincer movement. The inner pincer was designed to close on the Vistula River, surrounding the bulk of the Polish field army, while the outer, faster-moving forces were targeted on the Bug, cutting off any possibility of escape. The plan worked brilliantly. Never before had so much territory been gained in such a short space of time. After just 3 days of fighting, leading elements of the German army had pushed 50 miles into Poland. Whole Polish armies were in danger of being isolated. By the end of the first week, the Polish government had fled from Warsaw. In spite of some successful counterattacks early in the campaign, the Polish Air Force had been all but wiped out. German Stuka dive bombers were free to probe ahead of advancing panzer columns. The momentum of the German advance continued virtually unchecked. By the 8th of September, the German 4th Panzer Division had advanced nearly 150 miles, an average of more than 18 miles per day. By the same time, the Poles began to prepare Warsaw's defenses. The next day, initial German attempts to storm Warsaw were rebuffed. This was followed by a spirited Polish counterattack in the Bzura region, marking the start of the biggest battle of the campaign. But by now, the entire Polish army was becoming trapped inside an ever-decreasing circle of German forces. On the 10th of September, the Luftwaffe began to launch heavy raids on Warsaw, and the Polish government ordered a general military withdrawal to the southeast. On the 15th of September, the Germans issued an ultimatum to Warsaw: surrender or be destroyed. The garrison, supported by as many as 100,000 civilians, chose to fight on. Army groups north and south met at Wlodawa on the 17th of September, completing the outer ring of the German double pincer. From this double encirclement, only a small fraction of the Polish army could hope to escape. And on the same day, even this hope was dashed. Surrounded and besieged, the Poles received yet another crushing blow with the news that Soviet forces had entered the war on the German side. Signed the previous month, the secret Russo-German pact called for the division of Poland. While the Germans crushed any remaining Polish resistance in the east, the Red Army advanced on two fronts, north and south of the impassable Pripyat marshes, meeting negligible opposition. The Polish government, which had already changed its location 5 times, fled into Romania. On the 19th of September, the Polish army in the Bzura pocket was finally defeated. More than 100,000 men were taken prisoner. 2 days later, the Germans launched a massive bombardment of Warsaw. The next day, the Soviets occupied Lvov, and with the Germans mounted a joint victory parade in Brest-Litovsk. A further ultimatum was issued on the 25th of September to the citizens and defenders of Warsaw, emphasized by attacks by more than 400 bombers. Polish resistance began to weaken, and on the 26th of September, the Wehrmacht launched an infantry assault on the city. Within a day, the Germans had taken control of the outer suburbs, and the Polish commander, recognizing a lost cause, offered to surrender. A ceasefire came into effect the next day, the 28th of September. To the victors went the spoils of war. The Soviet-German partition of Poland came into force immediately with the signing of a treaty of frontier regulation and friendship on the 29th. Poland, as a nation, ceased to exist. To seal his triumph, Hitler flew into Warsaw on the 5th of October, and took the salute at a victory parade. Organized Polish resistance ceased the next day with the surrender of 8,000 troops southeast of Warsaw. For the Poles, defeat was now complete. Despite the desperate gallantry of its soldiers, the Polish army had been outclassed by a superior force from the start. The fatal weakness in Poland's defenses lay in her lack of armor and mobile forces. At the start of the war, 30 Polish infantry divisions had been supported by 13 cavalry brigades, just 2 of which were motorized. The remaining 11 still used horses. For Hitler, the Polish campaign had been a gamble which he'd taken and won. The Wehrmacht had committed most of its forces to operations in Poland. No more than a token covering force in the west was left to face an overwhelming French army of 70 divisions and a small British expeditionary force. Although dangerously overexposed, Hitler had calculated correctly that the Allies would do nothing if he invaded Poland. Once the subjugation of Poland was completed in early October, Hitler was free to turn his attention to further campaigns in the West. To the peoples of Western Europe, it seemed that military operations had ceased. The fighting war was apparently over, and what United States Senator Bora dubbed the phony war began. Chamberlain called it the Twilight War, while the Germans called it the Blitzkrieg. Chamberlain refused to consider any deal with Hitler. He believed that in the spring of 1940, the German people would realize that they can't possibly win this war. They would undoubtedly rid themselves of the Führer. The Allies would then be able to deal with some other German statesmen, such as Marshal Goering. Similarly, the French, and especially the French High Command, believed they were arguing from a position of strength. Following the end of the First World War, France had spent billions of francs on the construction of border fortifications known as the Maginot Line. Stretching from the Swiss border to the Belgian border, the Maginot Line consisted of a series of immense concrete fortresses. They were designed to be impregnable to conventional attack. However, for political reasons, the line did not extend along the Belgian border. As the Allies geared for war, French troops occupied the Maginot Line, while the British Expeditionary Force proceeded smoothly to their positions along the Franco-Belgian border. There, they built pillboxes and dug trenches. Both Britain and France still believed that war with Hitler could be avoided. There was no attempt to take pressure off the Poles during their ordeal by an Allied military action across the Rhine. This was much to the relief of senior Wehrmacht officers who knew that a thrust into the Saar could not have been opposed by the Germans. Further, it could even have sparked the anti-Nazi popular revolt of which Chamberlain dreamed. But nothing happened. Once the Poles had been beaten, the battle-proven German divisions redeployed swiftly across Germany to the Siegfried Line. Here they did nothing for the moment but glower at their opposite numbers and exchange insults with them daily through loudspeakers. The phony war lasted through the winter and into the spring, until German forces invaded Denmark and Norway, thus forestalling an Allied landing by a matter of days. German operations in Scandinavia began because the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, announced on the 8th of April 1940 that the Royal Navy were laying mines in Norwegian waters. The aim of this operation, which was a flagrant violation of Norway's neutrality, was to stop iron ore traffic between Sweden and Germany, which came through the Norwegian port of Narvik. But the possibility that British and French reinforcements and supplies might cross from Narvik into Sweden had already been brought to Hitler's attention. To the watching world, Germany's reaction to the Royal Navy's mining of the Norwegian waters, flagrant violation or not, appeared bewilderingly rapid, but it had, in fact, been planned for some time. In February 1940, Hitler had seen the dangers which Allied exploitation of Norway might hold for Germany, namely the threat to German iron ore supplies. He had also seen the advantages that possession of Norwegian ports would give to the Kriegsmarine. As a result, he had already ordered planning for what became known as Weserübung, exercise Spring Awakening. General von Falkenhorst and his staff had been given control of the operation, and it was by sheer chance that at the end of March Hitler decreed that the operations would be launched at dawn on the 9th of April, the day after Churchill's announcement. The first step was the German invasion and occupation of Denmark. This was achieved in a matter of hours. By dawn the following day, German troops were swarming ashore at Oslo, Bergen, Trondheim, and Narvik. At the same time, German paratroops seized Sola Airport near Stavanger and dropped later onto Fornebu Airport near Oslo. The Kriegsmarine ferried army units across the Skagerrak and Kattegat, losing 2 cruisers in the process. At first, only the Norwegian forces could offer any resistance, but before long an Anglo-French force had landed at Narvik, and British naval forces smashed most of the German warships in the harbour. Around Narvik, 2,000 German mountain troops were cut off from their supplies. They were driven from the town by the combined British, French and Polish forces. But the Allied success was short-lived as the ground troops were rapidly withdrawn to Britain. Elsewhere in Norway, the well-trained and equipped Wehrmacht, combined with the complete domination of the air by the Luftwaffe, ensured another victory for the Germans. For Chamberlain, the Norwegian campaign was a disaster. There were bitter attacks in the House of Commons against his policies of appeasement to which the government had clung for so long. The opposition railed against his pathetic optimism, both in dealings with Hitler before the war and in his attitude to Britain's defences since its outbreak. By 11 a.m. on the 10th of May, Chamberlain had accepted that he must give way to another leader, and at 6 p.m. Winston Churchill was asked by the King to form a government. In continental Europe, events were also unfolding rapidly. Early that same morning, Hitler launched his attack against neutral Belgium and Holland. The days of the phony war were gone forever. Shortly after 2:30 on the morning of the 10th of May, 64 German troops crossed the Dutch frontier. This was the spearhead of Germany's invasion of the Low Countries. 3 hours later, Leideborn troops dropped over the Belgian border to capture and demolish the huge fortifications at Ebenemme. The imposing concrete and steel fortress fell to a crack unit of Fallschirmjäger, paratroops, who landed by glider right on the roof of the fortress. At 5:35, the 30 divisions of General von Bock's Army Group B flooded forward across the frontiers from Maastricht up to the coast of the Ems estuary. To the south, the 44 divisions of General von Brunstedt's Army Group A moved through the Ardennes. This was the wooded country which French military commanders had proclaimed impassable for tanks since 1919. Setting out to prove this theory wrong was the main striking force of 7 panzer divisions under General von Kleist. Opposing the Germans were 20 Allied divisions comprising 5 of the British Expeditionary Force, 8 of the French First Army on their right, and 7 of the French 7th Army up on the coast around Dunkirk. German forces stormed across Holland and Belgium, supported by the full might of the Luftwaffe. Stubborn resistance by Dutch forces on the approaches to Rotterdam brought a brutal response. "100 Heinkel bombers were sent to attack the city on the 13th of May. In a devastating series of raids, they killed 1,000 civilians and made more than 70,000 homeless. Within a few hours, the Dutch government surrendered. The Allies were expecting the attack through the Low Countries and made their plans accordingly. But the 30 divisions of von Bock's Army Group B were actually a feint. They drew the Allied armies from the defensive positions they had so arduously prepared during the winter of 1939-40. By the evening of the 14th of May, the Allied line was formed as British and French troops moved forward to join the Belgian army. Movements were hampered by roads choked by refugees fleeing ahead of Bock's advancing infantry. Once again, the Luftwaffe was tasked with establishing air superiority and supporting ground operations. The Blitzkrieg on the Low Countries gave Allied troops their baptism of fire by Stuka dive bombers. Soon, they would come to associate the eerie, nerve-shaking howl from the Stuka sirens with death and destruction from above. The Allied defensive line stretched from the Scheldt to Namur. The northern sector was held by 3 divisions of the French 7th Army. The 50 miles southeast to Louvain were held by 13 divisions of the Belgian Army. Between Louvain and Wavre, the front was held by the BEF, and from Wavre to Namur by 6 divisions of the French 1st Army. Some of the battalion and brigade commanders were dismayed by the poor positions they now occupied, especially compared with those they had just left. If they were worried, the divisional and higher commanders were even more alarmed by events further south. They were only now becoming aware that Bock's slowly advancing army group was the lure to tempt them into a trap. This would release von Kleist's Panzer Group for the killing thrust through the Ardennes into France. The original German plan for the invasion of Western Europe was based on the opening attack of World War I. Hitler's High Command intended to occupy Belgium and France's northern industrial regions, but no further. They had no intention of repeating the ill-fated march on Paris they tried in 1914. That drive had taken them close to Paris, but they were eventually driven back and had to endure 4 bloody years of trench warfare. This time they would break the back of enemy resistance a single week, and the humiliation of 1918 would be avenged. Had the attack been delivered in autumn 1939, the generals would have had the war they planned. But Hitler had other ideas. He had fought in Belgium among the shattered villages around Ypres, where 1 million British and German soldiers were killed in 1917. Hitler knew the terrain, how artillery bombardments reduced the ground to a quagmire. Countless small rivers and streams offered endless obstruction to an invader. Surely it would be better to attack further south, perhaps through the forested hills of the Ardennes. The generals looked down their noses at this idea. By the time the postponed offensive was ready to roll in the spring, Hitler discovered that at least some officers shared his vision. General von Manstein was Chief of Staff to General von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief of Army Group A in the West. Von Manstein had studied the Ardennes region and had come to the same conclusion as the Führer. He discussed the idea with Germany's most influential tank expert, General Guderian. They argued for a radical strategy, to rush German panzer divisions along the narrow forest tracks and out onto the gently rolling hills of northern France. Bursting into open country, they would punch through the enemy before the defenses were ready for them. It would be difficult to bring enough artillery with these fast-moving formations, and other German commanders envisaged a pause while the guns were brought forward. A World War I-style battle would then take place along the River Meuse. Guderian and his tank men were confident they could storm the French defenses. The Luftwaffe's bombers, especially its fearsome Stukas, would provide close support in place of artillery. Hitler adopted von Manstein's plan and changed the orders to his commanders in the West. One thing Hitler could not change was the odds. Although Germany enjoyed superiority in the air, with 4,000 aircraft against 3,000 Allied, the Wehrmacht had only 141 divisions with which to attack 144 Allied divisions. In terms of armor, the Allies had the clear advantage, with nearly 3,500 tanks compared to the German total of just over 2,300. Worse for the Germans, many of these were light tanks of limited fighting ability. With the Allied field army lured from France into Belgium, the real German punch came through the Ardennes. Under von Rundstedt's Army Group A were 44 divisions, including 7 panzer divisions under von Kleist. Encountering little resistance from Belgian troops in the Ardennes, the panzers headed down the dirt roads in alarmingly dense columns. Military traffic police have seldom had a more decisive impact on a campaign. Thousands of vehicles kept to schedule, and by the evening of the 12th of May, German spearheads had reached the River Meuse. The French commander-in-chief, 68-year-old General Maurice Gamelin, expected German units to emerge from the Ardennes at some stage in the battle. But since he did not anticipate anything more than a light probing force, the French Ninth Army was stretched more thinly than other French armies. Guderian's tanks crashed through the impassable Ardennes as though on a peacetime exercise, brushing aside the French light cavalry unit which had been sent out to delay them. By the afternoon of the 12th of May, Guderian's 3 panzer divisions were across the French frontier and had reached the Meuse on each side of Sedan. By evening, German armor controlled the right bank of the river up as far as Dinan. On the 13th of May, Guderian's infantry paddled across the Meuse in rubber dinghies, while the French defenses were pulverized by attacks from 300 twin-engine bombers and 200 Stukas. The dive bombers attacked with particular accuracy, knocking out key French gun positions. The foot soldiers were across by 3 p.m. Combat engineers had a ferry operational in an hour, and by 4:30 a bridge was in place and the tanks could cross to the far bank. Once they'd got over the shock of the German arrival on the Meuse, the French High Command estimated that the crossing would take at least 4 days to organize and 2 more to carry out. They had overestimated by 5 days. By the morning of the next day, Guderian had 2 bridgeheads. Up at Dinan, the 7th Panzer Division, under the command of Major General Erwin Rommel, had formed yet another bridgehead in the face of desperate but sporadic French defenses. Early on the 15th of May, the German flood burst into France. From each of the bridgeheads, the panzers roared out, preceded by swarms of screaming Stukas. They were protected from British and French fighter attack by roving Messerschmitts. Refugees choked the roads, harried by Luftwaffe fighters. They were bullied by frightened and demoralized soldiers of their own side, or forced into the ditches by strange, ominous foreign vehicles, manned by blonde young giants who waved triumphantly at them. The Germans rarely harmed civilians deliberately, but left in their wake an impression of total invincibility. As in the Polish campaign, French counterattacks came too little and too late. All the first-line troops had been committed to the northern flank. The Allied strategy unraveled as the panzer divisions fanned out, racing ahead of their infantry and threatening to cut off the British and French armies in Belgium. That evening, German panzers were reported only 12 miles from Léon. France's new Minister of National Defense, Daladier, ordered a counterattack. Gamelin replied that he had no reserves because the bulk of French strength was locked up in the outflanked Maginot Line. At the same time, Gamelin announced that he could no longer take responsibility for the defense of Paris, and he issued orders for a general retreat of all French forces in Belgium. By chance, a copy of these orders reached the British Commander-in-Chief, Lord Gort, who ordered the retreat of his own BEF troops in Belgium. In a devastating indication of French morale, the French Premier Paul Reynaud woke Churchill with a telephone call announcing, "We have been defeated, we are beaten, we have lost the battle." But Churchill refused to abandon hope. There were still considerable French forces to the south of the German breakthrough, and even larger forces, including the BEF, to the north. Churchill hoped that between them they could maneuver to channel and then contain the German breakthrough. Then they could counterattack from both sides, cutting the enemy's spearheads off from their main sources of supply and support. The despondent French leaders were reluctant to admit such a scheme as possible, unless Churchill sent the entire RAF fighter force from Britain to France. Even then, it seemed most likely that the German forces would be either on the Channel coast or in Paris, or both, in a matter of days. In that case, the British and French armies to the north most probably faced early disintegration. Worse, unless a general armistice saved them, they also faced possible destruction. By the evening of the 20th of May, Guderian's panzer spearheads had reached Abbeville at the mouth of the Somme, and at this point their line was as thinned out as it ever would be. The Germans were vulnerable to a determined counterattack, but the only one which threatened the speeding panzers was by British tanks at Arras on the 21st of May. The Allies inflicted a stinging reverse on the SS Totenkopf division. But they quickly found themselves blocked by Rommel's panzers. After a brisk battle, the British were driven back to their original positions and threatened with encirclement. By the evening of the 23rd of May, Lord Gort was withdrawing the British brigades further north. 2 days later, it became evident to him that only a rapid retreat to the coast and evacuation to England would save even a quarter of his command. Gamelin also ordered a retreat without telling the British. The scale of the catastrophe suddenly became apparent, and the French government prepared to evacuate Paris. Meanwhile, Guderian's panzers had reached the French coast, and Gort chose to withdraw the BEF to Dunkirk. On the 28th of May, King Leopold of the Belgians signed an armistice with the Germans, and the Belgian army ceased to exist. This created a large gap on the left of the British defensive positions. It was filled during the night by General Montgomery's 3rd Infantry Division. The operation undoubtedly saved the BEF from annihilation by the Germans. Trapped in an ever-decreasing pocket, it seemed a matter of time before the British were destroyed. But then, fate stepped in. The Führer ordered his panzers to stop, allowing the British a breathing space. A fleet of 1,000 civilian boats helped the Royal Navy evacuate over 338,000 soldiers, including 100,000 Frenchmen in 9 days. The stop order may have been to allow Hermann Goering to make good on his boast that the Luftwaffe could finish the job. In the event, the Germans met with stiff resistance from the Spitfires and Hurricanes of the RAF, and in spite of some successes, the Luftwaffe was never able to impede the evacuation seriously. The miracle of Dunkirk kept Britain in the war. However, there was no hope for France, who had replaced the aging Gamelin with the even older General Weygand. He had been recalled from the Levant to take command of the French army when it became obvious that Gamelin had lost control. With German forces in their current positions, there was nothing except Hitler's orders to stop them turning south and pushing forward into the rest of France. As early as the 29th of May, the Führer had told both von Rundstedt and von Bock that their next task would be to settle the French army's account. Britain could wait, or better still, come to terms. Even before the Dunkirk evacuation was over, Bock had assigned his 18th Army to clear up Belgium and press on westwards. The remainder of Army Group B was ordered to take position along the Somme, to the right of von Rundstedt's triumphant infantry and panzer divisions closing up to the coast. By the 5th of June, the 10 panzer divisions of both army groups had been redeployed into 5 armored corps, 3 under von Bock, 2 under von Rundstedt. That morning at dawn, preceded as usual by swarms of dive bombers, 2 of the corps burst out of the bridgeheads west of Amiens. They drove for the Seine, bypassing the Maginot Line completely and leaving 400,000 unblooded French troops impotent. For the next few hours, the remaining French troops hurriedly assembled into hedgehogs around what their commanders considered strategic nodal points to hold back the Germans. They destroyed the leading panzer formations as they came within range and gave panzer commanders pause for thought. "The French are putting up strong opposition," reported one of them. "We are seeing a new French way of fighting." But instead of pausing to engage the static hedgehogs, the Germans simply chose to bypass them. By the 11th of June, the Germans controlled the Seine from Vernon to Le Havre. 2 panzer corps had passed the Chemin des Dames and were driving down between Reims and Aisne, and the German 9th Army was driving straight for Paris. The following day, Rommel's 7th Panzer Division reached St. Valery and captured the western flank of the French 10th Army, including the survivors of the British 51st Highland Division under their beloved General Fortune. 2 days later, on the 14th of June, German troops entered Paris, which was saved from damage by an open city declaration by the French government as it hastily left for Bordeaux. The spectacular advance of the German army was aided throughout by the incompetence of the French command. Under Gamelin, this had led to disaster, and under Weygand, it showed little improvement. Nevertheless, some French divisions defended their positions bravely, especially on the eastern sector where the 14th Infantry Division held 41st Panzer Corps. A little further west at Rethel, the 2nd Division for a whole day fought off every attack mounted against them. Instead of continuing to assault these positions, the panzers found the space between and drove through to Reims. Even at lower level, there seems to have been no French understanding of the impracticability of static defense against strong and mobile armor. But everywhere else, the French divisions were overwhelmed or cut off. Control from headquarters at all levels was lost. As the panzers cut deeper and deeper into the heart of France, morale plummeted and the French army moved ever closer to disintegration. Grey-clad infantry columns marching behind the panzers were used to isolate and mop up the strong points which their armored columns had bypassed. Resistance was light, though on occasion die-hard French troops put up a stiff fight. The German infantrymen had to clear towns and villages street by street. More often than not, however, the ordinary French soldiers simply surrendered. On the 11th of June, Weygand moved his GHQ from Paris to the Loire, where that evening the last of the Anglo-French conferences was held. The only viable course of action seemed to be to relocate French resistance to Britain, but this was rejected out of hand. Just 8 days later, Weygand ordered the remaining French army formations at the Maginot Line, amounting to 400,000 troops, to ask for a cessation of fighting with war honors. On the 16th of June, Reynaud resigned and Marshal Pétain took his place. He was determined to obtain an armistice from the Germans as quickly as possible and to establish a form of government of which Hitler would approve. By the 20th of June, German troops were in Lyon and Grenoble in the south, along the Swiss border to the east and controlling much of the Biscay coast to the west. Italian leader Benito Mussolini, who had declared war on both France and Britain 10 days earlier, urged his soldiers to cross the Franco-Italian frontier and capture Nice before the Germans got there. They were prevented by the events of the following day. At 3:30 p.m., a French delegation headed by General Hunziger was led into the very railway carriage at Compiègne in which the 1918 armistice had been signed, where they were awaited by Hitler and his entourage. Little negotiation took place, for Hitler was certain that he had won, and any arguments which Hunziger might have put up had to be referred back to Pétain, who tended to agree wholeheartedly with Hitler. By 7 p.m. on the 22nd of June, the armistice had been signed. The limits of German occupation were agreed, and the promise made that the French battle fleet would remain under French command. This satisfied Hitler, as one of his main fears had been the powerful French battleships might join the Royal Navy. On the 25th of June, Marshal Pétain announced over French radio, "Honor is saved. We must now turn our efforts to the future. A new order is beginning." 17 days later, the French Republic was abolished. The Blitzkrieg concept had proved stunningly successful. Tested in Poland, it had come to full fruition with the annihilation of French military power. The key to success was in concentration of force to make an initial breakthrough. This was followed by extremely rapid, well-directed exploitation before the enemy could react. Once a weak point in the enemy defenses had been identified, massed panzers advanced rapidly under supporting fire from artillery and dive bombers. Mechanized infantry were used to contain enemy strongpoints bypassed in the headlong advance, countering any moves against the German lines of communication. Support from the Luftwaffe was crucial. It was the novel use of dive bombers to crush opposing strongpoints which was most characteristic of blitz warfare. The speed of the attack was designed to cut enemy lines of communication. As the deep advances into the enemy rear continued, marching infantry followed behind to guard the flanks and prevent enemy counterthrusts. The theory of Blitzkrieg may have been simple, but in practice it required an immense amount of skill. It called for good communications and a very high level of cooperation between Army and Air Force. Before the war, the Germans had been able to train and practice such tactics to the point where they were almost routine. Dress rehearsals in Austria, the Sudetenland, and Czechoslovakia ironed out any flaws in theory and practice by the time Blitzkrieg became a reality in September 1939. In a few short weeks, Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, and France had been completely overwhelmed by the ruthless German war machine. Only Britain remained to oppose Hitler as master of Europe. And it was towards the British Isles that Hitler was to turn his attention next.